What's up, guys? Welcome to the first episode in an iteration of series that I'm going to be doing here on this channel. The first, I guess, actual video series or docu-series that I'm going to be doing, which is tracing the history of plants as we know it. And I guess to start off, I introduce myself. My name is Joshua Johnson. I'm a horticultural expert and botanist. I have degrees in science and in horticulture, and I'm still pursuing higher education, specializing in plant genetics. I have plenty of experience both inside and outside of the classroom. I've spent years in the field exploring how plants work, where they come from, and especially why they matter. Anyways, to get started, so where do plants come from? Well, in this series, we're gonna decode Earth's essential evolutionary tree, starting from the very roots, if you will, of evolution and where life comes from, all the way to the plants that are in your backyard and why they're there. So without further ado, so to understand the environment today, it's important to know where the environment evolved from, or at least the building blocks that began it 4.5 billion years ago. So that long ago, Earth was a violent newborn planet. It had very rudimentary rock curvatures, and there was plenty of volcanoes, asteroids constantly slamming into it. It's very similar to the modern day moon, except there was way more carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and water vapor all through well, it wouldn't technically be water, oxygenless water vapor. Oxygen was very devoid at this time. Anyways, this is primarily referencing the findings of a geologist named Claire Patterson in 1956, who used radiometric dating of relative meteorites to determine Earth's age. And meteorites are leftover pieces of the early solar system, or at least they can act that way, kind of acting as clocks in like a frozen stone almost. Anyways, in these early days, there was no real continents. Like I said, very, very rudimentary rock curvatures, very sparse land patterns. It's mostly water, just scattered volcanic islands amongst very vast oceans that slowly formed as the planet cooled. And as the planet cooled, a lot of rain and a lot more precipitation happened within the atmosphere. And these oceans that would fill up in the basins of these rock curvatures are eventually what we think gave rise to life as we know it. Life likely emerged 3.8 to 4 billion years ago, but how does life just form? So obviously we're divulging into what is a more debated, heavily skepticized field of study, which is the origin of the species, which I've read a lot of different novels, especially Charles Darwin's work with natural selection, but I'm just going to present what we got. I'm not taking a side or a path. I'm a biologist. I'm not your preacher. Anyways, life likely emerged 3.8 to 4 billion years ago. So the first model that we really have proposed to us around the 1920s by Alexander Oparin, which is the primordial soup model. You've probably heard of this. It suggested that life began in a warm, nutrient-rich ocean around this time that we were describing before, during the late Ordovician period. In 1953, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey simulated early Earth's atmosphere, zapped it with sparks, and within a week, amino acids and building blocks of proteins started to appear. So we're thinking that that could easily be proof in and of itself that life can evolve from these building blocks in this primordial soup. Another idea, the hydrothermal vent model, which hydrothermal vents are just underground high pressure sea caves that were very common during the Ordovician. They're still common now, but they were obviously very common during this time because there was like no land masses and everything was basically these hydrothermal vents. But this idea particularly came from a chemist named Gunther Worcestershire. I think that's how you pronounce it. Anyways, it proposes that life began in these deep sea vents, creating these bacteria, these cyanobacteria, archaea, and very extreme loving organisms. They originated in these hydrothermal vents, according to Gunther Worcestershire, because he was able to deduce that chemical energy and natural compartments for reactions could also create a sort of similar reaction that the primordial soup model creates, just under completely different conditions. Last but not least, the RNA world hypothesis gained traction after Thomas Cech discovered in 1982 that RNA can act as an enzyme, hinting that it could have been the first self-replicating molecule in and of itself. Modes. Anyways, getting into this RNA model, eventually the first true cells, prokaryotes, emerged, whether it was by the primordial soup model, the RNA model, or the hydrothermal vent model, or God's creation, whatever you want to say. We're at cells. Eventually, the first true cells, prokaryotes, emerged, splitting into two domains, bacteria and archaea. These are going to predate everything that every multicellular organism, these are singular cell organisms. So the earliest fossil evidence that we have comes from stromatolites, layered rock structures built by microbial mats, which are around 3.4 billion years old, first described in the Pilbara Crichton of Western Australia around the 1950s. So after the evolution of archaea and bacteria, which we're not going to dive super heavily into because, like I said, this is the evolution of plants, and we are going to skim over a lot of different evolutionary trees, especially here at the beginning, but if you hold on, we'll get more narrow and narrow as we continue this journey. Archaea and bacteria are finally here. Well, next, we have something called an apomorphy. Apomorphy is a term that we as genetic biologists use to describe what is an inherited new trait which is beneficial to the organism, an advantage. Anyways, a selective advantage that an organism evolves, an apomorphy. Around 2.7 billion years ago, a revolutionary apomorphy appeared. Oxygenetic photosynthesis. So photosynthesis finally appears, and the way that it appeared is cyanobacteria evolved to capture sunlight, split water molecules, and release oxygen. We know this from the fossil stromatolites and from chemical traces in those ancient rocks. Banded iron formations, alternate layerings of iron oxide and silica, these were all linked to the rising oxygen by Preston Cloud in the 1960s and Henrik Holland in the 1970s, shortly after the previous findings of Pilbara Crichton of the Western Australia in the 1950s. Oxygen first reacted with iron in the oceans around 2.4 billion years ago. Sulfur isotope anomalies vanished from sediments. Evidence found by James Fuqua and colleagues in the 1980s signaling oxygen had entered the air. These are all findings that we have to prove what is known as the Great Oxidization Event, which was both a blessing and a catastrophe. When these cyanobacteria finally evolved the ability to actually photosynthesize radioactive waves, it wiped out most anaerobic microbes because they were producing oxygen. Oxygen was devoid up until this point, and now we're going from oxygen devoid to very oxygen rich, and it absolutely filled the oceans and sponged to this iron to create such a high level of oxygen in the ocean before it was finally released into the atmosphere. This great oxygenation event wiped out most anaerobic microbes on Earth's first mass. It was one of Earth's first mass extinctions that we know of to date. But the survivors evolved aerobic respiration, yielding up to 19 times more energy from food than anaerobic methods. And this also gave rise to the first multicellular organisms, which is known as the eukaryotes, which is what we are, which is what everything that is biotic is that is not a prokaryote. It's a eukaryote, multicellular organism. So further on, around just 2 billion years ago, an archaeal cell engulfed that anaerobic bacterium. Instead of digesting it, they formed a partnership. And what was that anaerobic bacterium? Well, it just so happened to be the mitochondria. A mitochondria, that's right, the mitochondria was a archaeal cell that was engulfed by anaerobic bacterium. Well, it engulfed an anaerobic bacterium, sorry, I misspoke. The mitochondria was the bacteria that was engulfed by the archaeal cell. And this created one of the first endosymbiosis relationships, endo being inside, symbiosis being symbiotic relationship in the cell. That's what endosymbiosis means. Anyways, biologist Lynn Margulis, oh my god, I can't pronounce anything today, championed the endosymbiosis theory in 1967, and by the 1980s, 1990s, genetic sequencing confirmed the mitochondria has bacterial DNA and can replicate independently of the cell. So these were all ascribed to this as evidence that the mitochondria was a endosymbiosis relationship with archaeal cells, and that relationship evolved into eukaryotic organisms. This was the apomorphy that unlocked complex life, eukaryotic cells, and abundant energy for growth and complexity that we see today. From here, lineages would diverge, one leading to animals, to plants, to fungi, to protists, to us. The early animal path already bore its defining trait, which is mitochondria powered heterotrophy. So the main difference between us at this point and the lineage that would give its way to plants is that our lineage is busy using the mitochondria as a sort of predatorial thing. Our line, which is still just archaea bacteria at this point, is just feeding on other things through heterotrophy, whereas these organisms, through the evolution of photosynthesis with the cyanobacteria and then the relationship with the mitochondria and the archaeal cells, they are now able to be autotrophy, which is them producing their own food using the rays of the sun. So that's the main difference between our genetic lines. But from here, we're going to go through the first diversion branch, which is the first green branch, which is around 1.6 or 1 billion years ago, roughly a billion years after everything's been set up correctly. Another endosymbiosis changes history in which the eukaryotic cell engulfed a cyanobacteria, a eukaryotic cell engulfed the cyanobacterium that produces photosynthesis, and that gave birth to the chloroplast, which everybody knows what the chloroplast is. It's green, it does photosynthesis. Genetic sequencing from the late 1970s onward showed that chloroplast DNA is nearly identical to cyanobacterial DNA, and their double membranes match the signature of cellular engulfment, or at least that's what we understand of cellular engulfment. This apomorphy, or complex evolution that gives an advantage to the species, gave the Archaeplastidia, which is what we're talking about right now, the green lineage, the ability to turn sunlight directly into sugars, becoming the base of most food chains. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about the first green algae, which is where we're at now, and how they adapted to shallow waters to make their leap onto land. And we'll see the challenges they faced and the evolutionary tools that they invested, and maybe some of the wasteful investments that became extinct along the way. But from Stardust all the way to Sprouts, this is the story of how life got reshaped on the planet as we know it. And this is the story of plants as we know it. Thanks for watching.